Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers, and welcome back to another video. Is going to be a little bit different because I'm not just going to be explaining a concept, I'm going to be talking about a broad phenomenon and really explaining a number of concepts. What this hinges around is sort of the difference between Eastern and Western esotericism, Eastern and Western occultism, Eastern and Western mysticism, and generally why people are so fascinated by Eastern esotericism in the West. So we're going to be covering what these are, comments within them, similarities, and this general phenomenon of Westerners finding Eastern mysticism really fascinating, and how it's really not a new phenomenon and how people have been writing about it, discussing it for a really long time. If you're one of my followers who does not live in the West and you're over in the East somewhere, this is probably going to resonate with you a little bit differently than how it will with people like me who live in the West. So let's get into it. First, I want to talk broadly about what esotericism is. Esotericism is the hidden side of a religion. There are two sides of every spiritual tradition, exoteric and esoteric. Exoteric is, say, the stuff that you hear in church. They teach you the doctrine, the dogma, the orthodoxy. And esotericism is the inner, hidden tradition within a religion. Now, when I say West and East, I'm largely referring to civilizational blocks. You could break it up further and say that there is Western esotericism, Near Eastern esotericism, that would include things like the Middle East, that whole region, and then like Far Eastern esotericism, and that's where you'd put things like Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, but I'm just going to use East and West broadly, just for a heads up, and kind of put everything sort of together. So when we look at mystical tradition from the West, there are a number of different traditions that exist. Specifically, I think people immediately go to the grimoire traditions. That would be the Renaissance occultism that has things that we all are aware of, like Goetia. These would be the really big ceremonial processions, right? The big circles where you evoke spirits, and you have these very lavish, complex rituals. And then there is the lodge magical system of the Victorian period and onward that is sort of a lineage down from the Knights Templar. And it has things like Thelema, Golden Dawn Hermeticism, all that kind of stuff. And then there is like modern neo-pagan traditions that have emerged as well. And also there is the entirety of things like Christian mysticism, ancient pagan traditions that are kind of like the Delphic mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, Mithraism, all the sort of techniques that came out of the Nordic world, like the rune singing, Galder, all of that kind of stuff, we're going to put in the Western category. Obviously, academics define it a little differently. They have their own kind of semantics for it, but I'm speaking broadly about these things. Now, we looked at Eastern esotericism. We're going to see things like Sufism out of Islam. We are going to see Taoism, the I Ching, all the Vedic traditions, Vedanta, all these type of things, Tantra, all those traditions, and the East and West have been fascinated by each other for a long time. Western interest in Eastern esotericism goes way, way, way back. I think in modern times, we often associate Western interest with Eastern mysticism with the New Age movement, which broadly descends from Theosophy. Theosophy was created by a Slavic woman named Helena Blavatsky, who traveled the world. She was specifically very interested in India and brought a version of those traditions back to the West and then syncretized them with some Western ideas to create the system of Theosophy. Theosophy would then sort of have a bunch of stuff stem off of it. Rudolf Steiner, who created the Steiner school system, is a very notable one, and Alice Bailey, who would create the New Thought movement that would later become the New Age. So all of these groups had a strong interest in Eastern esotericism. Nowadays, you see a lot of people specifically being really into Hinduism. I think like the Hare Krishna group, which has a lot of, like there's a lot of people in my city who are Hare Krishna, who basically do a very specific version of Eastern esotericism. Often it is not the fullness of the tradition, and it is kind of a simplified version or only taken from one specific interpretation, which actually there was a Westerner who talked about this phenomenon before it became mainstream. That would be René Guénon. René Guénon was a Frenchman who was raised Catholic, who later left Catholicism in order to become a Sufi mystic, and he was heavily pulling from Hinduism and Islam in what he wrote about. And he wrote pretty extensively about this metaphysical clash of civilizations and the sort of argument for his Eastern proclivities and why he would eventually become a Sufi later in life. His argument was that in the West, there has been a lot of turnover, and a lot of Western traditions are really not that ancient. If we're talking about the Christian tradition, we're talking about something that goes back, 1,000 years or so, but if we're talking about the pagan traditions, we were talking about broken lineages, where they were essentially ceased to be practiced and then picked up later on. I think this is a little inaccurate with certain traditions, specifically in Eastern Europe, where there has been much more of a continuation, and as well when Christianity overtook Europe, a lot of pagan traditions were syncretized into it. But his argument was that the Eastern traditions have become more constant and more static, and he believed that finding the most static mystical tradition was the way to truth because he was a perennialist. Perennialism is an esoteric philosophy where basically you believe that there is a inner tradition that underlies all of religion, a truth, a pure gnosis. And to discover this, you have to have various spiritual experiences. And all religions that exist are essentially extrapolations out from this core inner truth. Kind of that there are multiple paths of the same mountain, though that expression sometimes gets misinterpreted to mean that all religions are true. Perennialism is not universalism. In fact, perennialism is rather strict because it argues that there is a truth, just a truth that we do not fully comprehend. My personal argument onto this is that we as humans are sort of little-brained and cannot comprehend the fullness of the mind of the gods themselves. So he became interested in Eastern esotericism because he saw it as more static and more close to what that inner tradition would be. And so he was seeking out the most static religion possible, which is a very different way of looking at it than, say, the theosophical approach, where you're sort of trying to discover truth. Because theosophy had this crux argument to it, that the highest form of religion is truth. That is Blavatsky's best and most infamous quote. She believed that to smash all these ideas together, we will eventually come to the inner truth. And that is also something that was done by certain sects of the Lodge magicians. The big breakaway from Lodge magic that is notable in incorporating Eastern esotericism would be Thelema. Thelema is a descendant of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which then descends from Gnosticism, and if you want to trace it all the way back, you can argue that it is a direct descent of Knights Templar, which Knights Templar, as people like to forget about, were actually quite Gnostic. And if you look at a number of their confessions, you can see some serious Gnosticism going on there. As well, the Knights Templar had a lot of historic interaction with the Order of the Assassins, a Shia Ismaili Sufi order, who did kind of their own version of Islamicate mysticism. So Thelema goes down this line, and Thelema develops an interest in Egyptian magic, or Kemeticism, and basically syncretizes a bunch of Egyptian paganism into these pre-existing traditions. Now, Gwenon often critiqued a lot of these movements by arguing that they are kind of a superficial interest in Eastern esotericism, and not for the same reasons that he was. Now, no matter what reason it is, there is clearly an interest in looking eastward from Western people, and there has been for a long time. So why and what are the ideas that overlap? Because I think a lot of people get interested in this stuff because they are looking for overlapping ideas. They're looking for things that occur again and again and again. The fact that certain traditions and practices occur again and again and again and again is a pretty common argument that perhaps there is some real religiosity to this world. Perhaps it's not that people randomly came up with traditions, but that there is something deep there. That the fact that everyone seems to be discovering the same things again and again and again and again and again and again. So a few that I immediately think of when I think of overlapping traditions is I think to meditation. Pretty much every religion has some version of meditation. Obviously, how it's done is going to vary a bit, but you see meditation in every mystic tradition. Whether it is the contemplative prayer of Christianity, where you read a Bible verse and then meditate on it, or it is, say, the various meditation traditions and disciplines that emerge from Buddhism. We see meditation coming up again and again and again. It's really everywhere. It's in Hinduism. You see it in various Sufi sects do various versions of meditation, and modern pagan traditions also do a lot of meditation. So that is one that's obviously pretty universal. I would say mantras and repeating things, like repeating the same statement again and again, is something you see a lot in Eastern esotericism, and one of the things that has kind of been broadly borrowed into Western esotericism. Now, this does predate that too, because there's a specific thing in the Nordic traditions called Galder, which is basically singing the runes. Basically what you do, and I did this in a group ritual, it was really interesting, is you start at a really low tone of the rune, right, and you say it, and then you repeat it, and getting progressively louder. I can't be certain that's the only way to do it. That's the way that I was taught to do it when I was in a group ritual. And that is obviously similar to the mantras that you see in Hinduism and the Vedic traditions. In those, you use specific Sanskrit mantras that sort of represent various things, and their pronunciation is rather important. So those obviously kind of get brought over. And then if you look at Islamicate mystical traditions, you will notice that a big thing that is done in them is a repetition and a chanting, whether it's chanting the names of Allah, the 99 names out there, or it is using, say, something like the Shams al-Marif, where there are a bunch of times where when they're doing like complicated jinn rituals, which are obviously kind of in the sorcery category in the Islamicate world, and far more controversial, there is still this repetition, this chanting of specific names and specific terms. And if you look to the West, within Kabbalah, that is also a thing that happens again and again, except they tend to do it with the letters, specifically the mother letters, I think, are one that I think most people who are familiar with those traditions will be aware of. Another overlapping between Western and Eastern esotericism is the use of the elements. So the elements change a little bit. In Western esotericism, we are all familiar with earth, air, water, fire, and arguably spirit, and in some people's views, void, though that's not discussed a ton. Now, if you look to the East, you see in the Chinese traditions, there are actually 5 elements, which are pretty similar to the Western ones, though there are some things that change, specifically the use of wood. And if you look to those traditions, those are heavily incorporated. And if you look to actually different types of medicine, you will see that a lot of the traditional medicines do use those. Western traditional medicine has largely been lost to modernity, but it is still there. There is still a complex and complicated herbal tradition in the Western world. And if we look to documents like the Greek magical papyri, one of the very few occult grimoires we have left from Hellenic antiquity, you will notice extensively that there are different herbal blends of incenses and oils that are used. As well, if we turn to the Solomonic grimoire traditions, you will see that there are very specific things that you use to make ritual things. As well, if you look to the Bible itself, the abramelin oil that is made iconic by modern Western esotericism, which is a sort of adaptation of a ritual that happened in about the 1200s that then pulls back to the early sections of the Bible, you will see a specific oil constructed there that has been modernized several times and made an essential part of a number of modern Western esoteric traditions. So this use of plant matter is actually incredibly important. If we look to modern witchcraft traditions, I specifically am talking about these sabbatic traditions, as controversial as they may be, their sort of later evolution off of what it is, became very interested in what they call phytognosis, or gnosis from plants, where essentially when you sort of consume a herb, it kind of in a sense possesses your senses. Very literally, when you smell something, it enters your senses and it enters your brain. And so using different plants, you can sort of connect to them intrinsically and develop your relationship with that spirit, which is tapping into an ancient European knowledge that has been lost. In the ancient European world, plant spirits were actually an essential part of their traditions. In paganism, the land was everything, and the connection between the self, the soul, and the land was a vital part of the theology and metaphysics. Thus, these simple ideas that are often forgotten and that many Westerners only see in, say, Chinese traditional medicine, even though that is a little less spiritual than what I'm describing now, they find that appealing because it connects to something that they have lost. Because fundamentally, the drive to be interested in Eastern occultism is generally a drive for a return to what mysticism was. Because largely in the West, especially in the Anglosphere, there has been a detachment from mysticism at all. Specifically because Protestant Christianity has declared all mystical things satanic, evil, and basically written it out of the consciousness. You're seeing this now a little bit in the Eastern world with certain movements arguing that any sort of mystical practice, whatever, is like some innovation that needs to be banned and destroyed. But the thing is, the human mind craves these mystical things because they are fundamentally part of our experience as human beings. Religion, gnosis, these are all human drives. We as humans know that there is something more than the material being and the material plane. Thus, we are always going to seek it out. And so when you're living in a culture where your religious traditions have been lost and sort of forgotten, you're going to look to other things that are static and connected to that tradition, as one would say, because we crave that, we need that. And so that is why Westerners have largely turned eastward, and probably will continue to for some time, because fundamentally that argument has a lot of truth to it. But does that mean that the Western traditions are useless or bad or not worth pursuing? No, the Western traditions are beautiful, but it will take some reconstruction and some revivalism to make them what they once were. The question for us, should we get into Eastern esotericism or Western esotericism? Which is sort of the direction to choose? Now, I think an answer that a lot of modern esotericism gives you is that you don't really have to choose, and that syncretism is a very powerful option, because largely modern esoteric and religious traditions are syncretic, though that's not a new thing. That actually goes way back. I brought up the Greek magical papyri earlier, and I want to bring it up again. The Greek magical papyri was a Hellenic pagan document. Unquestionably, that is what it is. But you see influences from other traditions pretty extensively throughout it. And really what the theosophists and the perennialists have been trying to do for the past couple hundred years is to create some sort of return to the truth by discovering the truth through smashing ideas together. I don't really see a problem with this. And I don't think you need to see it as this big clash or choice in the mind, but if you're going to, if you're someone who wants to pick a side, let's go through which one you should go with based on who you are and what you're interested in. obviously your ancestral connection is going to be something to consider, because this is the thing, like, there is some truth to the idea that if you are ancestrally connected to something, you're probably going to relate to it, because really all religions incorporate ancestral veneration in some way. In the West here, you look at the pagan traditions and the ancestors were venerated incredibly highly. You look to the African traditional religions, a lot of their gods are just collected ancestral spirits. Now you look eastward, you'll see a heavy amount of ancestral veneration. I remember I went to a Shinto festival at one point, like I went to a Shinto event in the city, and it was a really beautiful thing. It was celebrating this sort of seasonal festival thing, and there was literal ancestral reverence going on and land reverence, and I thought it was quite nice. So that's gonna be a factor you wanna consider, like, where do you come from? What are your roots? What do you feel connected to? And then another thing is the traditions themselves. In the West, these traditions operate pretty differently from each other, right? Like, for some occult traditions, you actually have to go out of your house, touch grass, and join an order and initiate in and do all that stuff. Same for the Sufi traditions. You have to go outside. If you're in, like, I don't know, Ohio, that's probably gonna be hard for you. I don't know how you're gonna do that. And then for other traditions, they're much more solitary and much more personal. And then for some, they kind of hinge on having a family connected to it and devoting the house to whatever religion or spirit you're looking at. So those are all the practical considerations. And then the next would be like, what interests you? What makes sense to you? Because we have to think about cosmology. And this is something that I think a lot of Eastern-West sync traditions struggle with. Because for something to be true and for something to work, for some god to answer your prayer, for some ritual to work, there has to be some cosmological reason to it. I've become in time increasingly hostile to the idea that this is all psychological and like you can do whatever you want and clashes and contradictions don't matter, because contradictions do matter. And if you see a deep contradiction in your religious worldview, it's something to contemplate on and try to suss out what it came from. Like, why do I believe two things in opposition? And if they are both true when I use them ritualistically, what does that actually mean? Because the truth is you need to have some sort of cohesive metaphysics. Maybe not when you're new, you're gonna figure that out, but you should be thinking about this. And if something works that you weren't expecting to work, think about how that changes everything else you believe. So that's my advice. Obviously do research on things. I think reading like theosophy books only is probably not a good move. I have beef with Blavatsky. Just beef there. There are great writers who have talked about this clash. I've been reading the book East and West by Renee Guénon, and it's been really illuminating, and it's what inspired me to make this video. So definitely read that one. It makes an argument far further than I will make, but it is quite interesting. And to think about, you know, like what draws you to the traditions you like. Because as humans, we are all motivated by our subconscious. To truly be self-aware, you need a constant contemplation practice, because we are driven by things beyond our conscious mind. If we can understand that metaphysics, magic, the gods, all this exist, there must be some sort of drive for everything we do, right? I don't think that's a crazy idea when we consider everything else that religion argues. So I wish you luck with your seeking, and I hope this is sort of food for thought and my little conspiracy theory onto why Westerners feel very dissatisfied with the current religious status quo and why we are often looking eastward. I think it really is a desire to return to mystery traditions that have been lost and to look for something static, whether we are consciously aware of that or not. Also, one final note, I forgot to add this. You could make a metaphysical ages argument about this, that we're sort of going through a series of metaphysical aeons, and our changing religious interest reflects that, with the first aeon being the pagan mommy goddess aeon, the second being the very divine masculine heavy era of Christian dominance, and then now being whatever is coming next, whatever that is. I mean, you can make that argument too. I may make that in another video. I may talk about metaphysical ages another time, because I do think that is sort of a component to this video, but this video will be an hour long if I do that, and I think you guys only like it when I podcast for that long. I think you would get bored. So take care, like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. It genuinely helps me out, and please join the Patreon if you want more of these videos. I release a ritual guide every single neo-pagan Sabbath, extra video every single month, early access to all my videos, and special things for higher tier patrons, including meeting with me once a month for spiritual advice, consulting, or just to ask me questions. You can use that time however it is you will. So take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Oh, you can also find me on pretty much every social media platform under the sun. I am on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Telegram, Substack, everywhere. And I also use a podcast, Postmodern Iconoclast, which is available on this YouTube channel or on most podcasting platforms, really every podcasting platform except Apple Podcasts, because we don't get along. So I'll see you guys in the next one. And if you did the like, comment, subscribe, you'll meet your holy guardian angel in 93 days, and you will never need to watch another one of my videos ever again. And won't that be peace, freedom, and tranquility?